If you take out your message outline, you can follow along either on paper if you like to take notes or up on the screen if you'd rather not take notes. We are doing a series entitled, Is God a Moral Monster? And out in the foyer you'll see this handout which tells you the different topics we're going to be talking about and when. And if you have a friend that you think would be interested in one or more of these, feel free to invite them and give one of those to them. There was a woman who was married, young woman, and she decided that she wanted her portrait painted, oil painting. And so she found an artist and sat down, met the artist for the first time. And of course, she had her hair all done, her makeup and her nails, and a beautiful gown that she was wearing. And just before they started, she asked the painter, can you do me a favor? I want you to paint into the picture diamond earrings on my ears, and a diamond necklace around my neck, and a brooch made of gold and rubies, and then a beautiful emerald ring. And the painter was sort of struck by that. It never happened. This happened before, and he said, "Well, now why is it that you want to do that? Because I've never had anybody say that." And she said, "Well, I'm still relatively young, and if I die before my husband does, I'm sure he's going to remarry again fairly quickly. And I really want wife number two to just go crazy about where are those jewels?" Jealousy. There was a story of a woman who was getting ready for her wedding day. She was very excited about this. But a shadow had sort of come over this because her parents had just gone through a very nasty divorce. And it was pretty awful, but she was determined to have her perfect day anyway. And so it was time to go out and look for gowns, and she asked her mother to come with her, and they went gown shopping, and they found a beautiful gown for her. And then they were looking for a dress for the mother to wear as mother of the bride on that special day. And they found the perfect dress. The mother of the bride was just thrilled with this and went home and very excited. It was a great moment for mom and daughter. And then a few months passed on, and just about 10 days before the wedding, the bride-to-be was at her mother-in-law-to-be's house, dropping something off, and the mother-in-law said, "Oh, I found the dress I'm going to wear as mother of the groom." And she went back and she brought it out, and it was the exact dress that her mother had picked out several months prior to this. And, of course, the bride was horrified by this, and she asked her future mother-in-law, she said, my mom bought the exact same dress for the wedding. Would you mind taking it back and getting something else? And the mother-in-law thought about it for a moment. She said, "Well, no, I'm not going to do that. It's a beautiful dress. I love the dress. I look great in the dress. And you know what? Your mother wearing that dress and I wearing that dress, there's something cute about that." And so the daughter went home, and she knew this was not going to go well. So she made this announcement to her mother about what had happened, and her mother had this look of horror on her face, like this was a catastrophe. And she said to her daughter, "That's okay, honey. I'll go and get another dress." "Are you sure, Mom?" "Yes, I know. I'll go." So they went dress shopping, and they found another dress that would be suitable for the mother of the bride. And as they were checking out, the daughter said, "Well, Mom, aren't you going to exchange the dress you bought? I mean, there's really not an event you can wear that to, is there?" And she said, "Oh, yes, there is. I'll be wearing the original dress the night of the rehearsal dinner, the night before the wedding." The power and smallness of jealousy. Jealousy. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, writes, and I quote him, that it looks to him like God breaks into a monumental rage whenever his chosen people flirted with a rival God. And if you read some of the books that atheists have penned or agnostics about God, one of the pictures that you get of their view of God is that God is small, that he's petty, that he flies into a rage over the smallest of things, and that he's jealous. Oprah Winfrey years ago said that she was turned off to Christianity originally because she'd heard a preacher talk about that God is a jealous God. And she really didn't want anything of what she thought about that. Now, of course, the word jealousy just begs for a definition because it has different usages in our culture. There's the obvious bad jealousy, which are encompassed in those two stories I told us a moment ago. But there's also a good jealousy, and there is a godly jealousy. The bad jealousy, of course, is that which is within us and comes out of us that is centered around ourself and what we are afraid we're not going to get, or the fear of what we're going to lose. And therefore, we react with sort of this visceral sense of jealousy. In James 3:16, the writer says, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. In other words, whenever there's jealousy alive in the human heart, you can expect there to be drama, relational drama and misery, as you would anticipate on those two stories I told at the beginning of this message. Now, I remember as a kid, I was in junior high and had never aware of jealousy before, and until I had a girlfriend. And one day I saw my girlfriend talking to another guy. I think it was in the hallway, just by the lockers. And I remember being puzzled by this because there was something in me that sort of thought, I need to do something. There's something wrong about this situation. I need to do something. And all I can remember thinking was making this connection. I need to somehow express a sense of jealousy because in this foolish mind, jealousy assures my girlfriend that I care and that I love her. Now, that's what I was thinking, stupidly, foolishly. And so I don't remember exactly what happened, thankfully, but I do remember going over there and saying something probably incredibly stupid with a sense of anger in it and unrighteous anger. And all I remember was I created a big mess. And I was shocked because I thought that this was going to communicate love and care, and it ended up doing exactly what James tells us, that it created disorder and every vile practice. Paul gives a good illustration of good jealousy, or as he describes, a godly jealousy, meaning the same kind of jealousy that God has for his people. It's in 2 Corinthians 11:1. I hope that you will put up with a little of my foolishness, but you are already doing that. And then he says to them, I am jealous for you. And the preposition is very important. I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. I promised you to one husband, to Christ, so that I might present you as a pure virgin to him. And he's describing his jealousy, that he's jealous for them, a good jealousy or a godly jealousy. And he immediately illustrates it in the same sentence with a picture that we're all familiar with. The father of the bride is coming down to the day when he's going to present his daughter to be married to the groom, and he's walking her down the aisle and gets to that moment where he hands her off. And it's a proud father moment, a good father moment. And in that picture, what Paul describes here, there are a lot of years that have gone into the shaping of your daughter to help her to become the woman that she is on the day of her wedding. And what Paul says is, in the same way, that's what I'm doing. That's how I see myself as I relate to the people in the church here in Corinth. That I'm like a proud father who's been shaping you and wants to present you someday to the real groom, to Christ. And then notice what he says. But I am afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Meaning that on that day that I want to present you, Corinthian church, to Christ, metaphorically speaking, I'm afraid that when I walk you down the aisle, there's going to be something about you that is really not devoted to the groom. Something else has snuck in there that captures your devotion more than Christ. Now, there are three pictures that I'd like to highlight this morning that give an illustration of the jealousy, God's jealous love for us. The first is the picture of marriage. And some of the different things you read in our secular culture about what atheists or agnostics say about God, you get the impression that you're reading about a force or a principle or something material, but definitely not something personal. And exactly the opposite is true. We will never understand God's righteous, godly jealousy of us if we see God as something less than personal, somebody without a heart. In fact, what's even more astounding to me is that God has put himself in a position to be rejected by billions and billions of people over millennia. There's a heartache that he goes through and an anguish because there's something that he sees we could enjoy, his presence, and to walk with him and to know what it's like to be loved with a pure love, and yet we settle for something else, something lesser than that. You hear something of the pathos of God's heart in Romans 10. He says, all day long I've held up my hands. I've held up my ear, longing here to a disobedient and obstinate people. There's a yearning here for his people to be in fellowship with him and to be devoted to him in their hearts. And it just doesn't happen. But tomorrow he's going to call out again. And the next day he's going to call out again with open hands, opening his heart, even if it means rejection. In Ezekiel 6, the prophet Ezekiel has some of the prophecies that he speaks to the remnant that's still in Jerusalem and in Judah. And some of the prophecies are to the people who've been taken off to Babylon in exile. And notice what he says, how God describes what happened, what brought about judgment ultimately. In Ezekiel 6, verse 9. Then in the nations where they have been carried captive, those who escape will remember me. Meaning that they didn't remember him in all the years leading up to warnings from the prophets and the judgment to come and judgment. Not until they were taken captive will they suddenly go, hey, how did this happen? How did we get here? At this moment in a captivity, they will remember me, how I have been grieved, God says, by their adulterous hearts, which have turned away from me, and by their eyes, which have lusted after idols, putting something else in that prime spot in their heart, of which they are devoted to. They will loathe themselves for the evil they have done and for all their detestable practices. God is jealous for us because of what he wants for us, in the same way that as a brand new groom thinks about what he wants to give to his bride and bless her, and what the bride wants to give to her new husband, in that same way, that's a good jealousy. And that good jealousy leaps into action when the person that we're married to is settling for something far less. The second image is one of covenant. Picture of a covenant. Now, covenant in the scripture means a solemn agreement. And God again and again makes agreements with his people, covenants with the people. And again, the people break the covenant. And God is still committed to the covenant, even though the people break it. Now, the idea of covenant is built into the heart of a wedding ceremony. From the Bible's point of view, a marriage is essentially a covenant, a solemn agreement entered into between two people that is really hard to break. Only adultery, and if you're married to a non-Christian and they wanted to be divorced from you, only those two things can break this solemn covenant, this agreement that you've made. And it's so important that that's how a wedding ceremony, if there's nothing else, there is the exchange of vows. The I do. This is what you can count on from me through thick or thin. After the people came out of Egypt, out of slavery, and watched the Egyptian army be destroyed as the walls of the Red Sea came crashing down on the chariots and horsemen, the people stood on the eastern side of the Red Sea in awe. And they realized that they had freedom and they were moving off towards the promised land. It wasn't very much time that passed when Moses told the people about the covenant God wanted to make with them. And when the people heard the covenant, they said in Exodus 24, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. They said, where's that document? We'll sign the document. We'll sign the contract. We're on. God's our God. We'll follow. And then within a very short time, Moses goes up the mountain to get what we refer to as the Ten Commandments and the law. And he's up there a while. And chapter 32, just 8 chapters after the people had made their public commitment to the covenant, records, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron, who was number 2 in command. Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. He's up on the mountain. The clouds, dark, thunder. The law is being given. Aaron answered them, take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and daughters are wearing and bring them to me. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol, cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. The covenant is broken here because the people choose a different God to sit in the place of prominence. And God has moved aside, away from that particular place of promise. Now, the covenant being broken with God, for the most part, as fallen human beings, we don't generally see that as that big a deal. But let me illustrate in a small way how big a deal this is. Imagine that you married the woman of your dreams or the man of your dreams, and you went on your honeymoon and were having a great time in some foreign resort place. And on day 3, you had gone down to buy something, some coffee and a little pastry. And on day 3 at night, you come back and find your spouse in bed with somebody else. Imagine standing at the door of your hotel and looking at this. The horror of it is that you made a covenant in good faith. And you thought your spouse made a covenant with you in good faith. And suddenly, there's no faith being seen on the part of the other person. That is the breaking of the covenant. Now, in the same way that would horrify you and break your heart, that's what happens to God when we turn away from the covenant he has made to us, where he is first in our hearts and we put anything else in his place. In Ezekiel 16, the prophet Ezekiel again looks back and he says, you trusted in your beauty. And he's speaking to the nation as a whole. And you used your fame to become a prostitute. And he's using, again, an analogy here of the marriage metaphor and running from the marriage metaphor to find some other husband or wife, so to speak, some other thing that you are most committed to and that you trust more than anything else to make life work. You lavished your favors on anyone who passed by, and your beauty became his. Now here, what he's describing in part is that they made alliances with Egypt particularly and some of the other nations, hoping to fend off nations more powerful than them, like Assyria and Babylon. At the head of every street, you built your lofty shrines and degraded your beauty. And here he's talking about all the different gods that they would pick and choose from, and sort of to cover all their bases, we might say, to make sure that life works like we want to. And again, he wraps up this reality in the analogy of marriage and prostitution. Offering your body with increasing promiscuity to anyone who passed by. The first, why is God a jealous God? Well, the imagery of marriage and the heart of marriage, his commitment to our best is there. And the covenant-making God is the second picture of why God is jealous, is he wants to be faithful to us and to the covenant he made. The third picture is what we might call tough love. The picture of tough love, or better known in the Old Testament as Judgment Day, or the Day of Judgment. One of the shows that came out, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or maybe longer, was a show called Intervention. And it's an interesting show in all of its sadness. But there's one particular person, man or woman, that has some type of addiction, usually to drugs or alcohol or combination of these things. And the people that are friends and co-workers and neighbors and relatives have all tried to talk to this person to alert them to what's going on and the misery that's coming on them, but none of it works. And so the people start talking together and they think, We should have an intervention in which we're all going to gather at the same place, and somebody's going to bring so-and-so to the meeting, and we're all going to sit in the room, and all of us in one sitting are going to say the effect of what this person's behavior on him or her and us is like. And I'm always astounded whenever I see that show of the response of the person in the middle, so to speak. Because usually the word that comes out, or the idea that comes out from the person in the middle is something like this: all of you are overreacting. Why are you going to all this? I'm in control of this, and I can turn this off whenever I want to. I'm not addicted. And, of course, everybody's heard this. But what's interesting to me is that the person is largely blind to what everybody else in the room can see. And this is sort of the blinding nature of sin and the proud justification of sin and the minimizing of sin. We just don't want to think it's as bad as this, or that the effect is as bad as all these people are making out it to be. And yet, it is. In the same way that happens in a show like Intervention, this happened with the nation of Israel as a whole. En masse, everybody. In chapter 4 of Amos gives an illustration of this. The sovereign Lord has sworn by his holiness. The time will surely come when you will be taken away with hooks, the last of you with fish hooks. And the idea is, which eventually happened, is that the Babylonians would put hooks in the mouth, like fish hooks in the mouth of the people, and string them along on the march off to Babylon. You will go straight through breaks in the wall, and you'll be cast out towards Harmon, declares the Lord. Now, the people did, in response to almost all the prophets, exactly what the person in the show Intervention does. You're overreacting. Or, how can you be so negative? Why are you focusing on the bad part? Why aren't you telling us about peace and how we can have peace and how our life can be better? Aren't you overreacting? And then God responds sort of preemptively and with sarcasm to what he knows he's going to hear next and what he knows the people are going to revert to instead of repentance and faith. And they're going to revert to, isn't there something religious I should do that will mitigate against judgment coming? This happened again and again and again in the Old Testament. So in verse 4 of Amos 4, he says, with sarcasm, dripping with sarcasm, go to Baal, or go to Bethel and sin, like you always do, this holy place. You're going to go to Bethel and sin. Go to Gilgal, another holy place, yet sin some more. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 years. Burn leavened bread as a thank offering and brag about your free will offerings. Boast about them, you Israelites, for this is what you love to do, declares the sovereign Lord. In other words, your heart is going to go not to repentance and faith, not to my heart is devoted to almost anything else except God. It's going to go, okay, I'll start going to church again. I'll go to a Bible study. I'll start reading my Bible. I'll give in the offering. I'll sign up for some ministry. That's what we do. And God says, no, 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 no. I want your heart. It's your heart. And then notice the tough love that is described in the book of Amos as God relates to the people. Verse 6, I gave you empty stomachs in every city and lack of bread in every town. In other words, there was some famine that came along, and it wasn't just because the weather was bad or the weather conditions were bad. God imposed this upon the people to try to get their attention, to shake them, to awake them, like an intervention does with somebody in the circle there. And yet, you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. Wow, a famine. You would think that would get people's attention, the nation's attention. And yet it didn't. So if God sees the people are going on a course that's going to be self-destructive to them and destructive to other people, what's he left to do? He's left to ramp up tough love, which is the next thing. Verse 7. I also withheld rain from you when the harvest was still 3 months away. If you're a farmer, that creates a crisis. I sent rain on one town, but withheld it from another. One field had rain, another had none, and dried up. People staggered from town to town for water, but did not get enough to drink. And then he finishes with the same thing he wanted them to hear the first time. Yet, you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. Verse 9, many times I struck your gardens and vineyards. I struck them with blight and mildew. Maybe that's what happens to me when I try to grow something. Maybe it's not just me. I struck them with blight and mildew. Locusts devoured your fig and olive trees. Yet, you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. This just goes on and on and on. What's God left to do? If you're in an intervention with somebody and they absolutely refuse to go to a rehab facility to do, what's left for you to do? Just to be syrupy is not going to help the person. Verse 10, I sent plagues among you as I did to Egypt. I killed your young men with the sword, meaning he brought war. Maybe that will capture their attention. Along with your captured horses, I filled your nostrils with the stench of your camps, meaning the dead. They had a hard time keeping up with the burial. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. Even with that, verse 11, I overthrew some of you as I overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. You were like a burning stick, snatched from the fire. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. The people were still on a collision course with destruction and misery and exporting that destruction and misery to the people around them. What's left to do? And then these words, these famous words from the book of Amos, Amos chapter 4, verse 12. Therefore, this is what I will do to you, Israel. And because I will do this to you, prepare to meet your God, O Israel. There comes a point in which the destruction is so great of self-destruction and destruction that it has on others that God says, time is up. It's not a loving thing to allow this destruction to continue on unabated where it affects other people. This is going to stop. Now, as in the New Testament, what do we make of judgment? Well, as Christians, we are promised that we will not have to go through judgment. That happened at the cross. But there are times in our life where we go through what the New Testament calls discipline. And the parallel here is of a father or mother who disciplines their child, not because they're mean, but because the child needs discipline. And this is from Hebrews chapter 12, starting with verse 7. And your hardship as discipline, God is treating you as sons. What son is not disciplined by his father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. If your son or daughter is going off in a destructive, self-destructive way or a destructive way to others, and you do nothing, there's a question about whether you really love that child. Or here, as the writer says, is that really your kid? Because if it was your kid, you would jump in there and do something about this. Verse 9, moreover, we all have had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. I certainly am glad my father spanked me when I was growing up. It helped shape me from further foolishness than some of you already know I dabbled in. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? The idea is submitting to discipline, whether I'm aware of why it's needed or not. Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good that we may share in his holiness. Verse 11. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. Now, we may not know exactly why we're going through a time of discipline, but at least we have several generalities that are likely true that are mentioned in this passage, that we may share in the holiness of God. He's changing who we are, and for the sake of righteousness in our hearts and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. The three images of God's jealous love for us is the picture of marriage, and number two, the picture of a covenant, and sometimes when it's needed, tough love or discipline. Several decades ago, a Presbyterian minister wrote a paragraph that I thought for the most part summarized this message very succinctly, and I'd like to close our message with this. Quote, anything less than our highest good is offensive to him. You catch that? Anything less than our highest good is offensive to him. He is jealous of anything that menaces our well-being, not for his sake, but for ours. He is jealous of other gods, not because they threaten him. He really is very secure, but because they threaten us. When Israel was guilty of idolatry, it was Israel who suffered, and God's jealousy was his distress at her folly and his sorrow at her needless suffering. His desire was to have her worship only the highest and the noblest. He was jealous of the false gods she went after because they were not worthy of her. He thought more highly of his people than they did themselves. They were too easily pleased. It was only in him, their creator and savior, that they could know their chief end and greatest good. They had no higher good beyond him. What he wished to give them and what he wanted them to want was himself. Let's pray together. Father, it's all week I was just thinking about how so far away of this picture of godly jealousy we think of you. And in this sense, how small we think your love for us is. And how easily enamored we are with almost anything else at the moment that we think will satisfy our souls like nothing else. And every day, sometimes in anguish and sometimes with pathos, you call to us. And you hope we'll respond and answer. You hope that our devotion will be sincere for you. And yet, I can tell you from my own personal experience that my heart wanders so easily to almost anything in any given moment except you. And so as we think about this, we are left as broken and yet wonderfully beloved, that you do love us, knowing full well what you have when you have the likes of us. That you will not give up on us. That in spite of repeated failures, that you will continue to work in our lives to bring discipline where it's needed, encouragement and comfort at other times, but to finally bring us home one day to be like a bride. Walk down the aisle between this world and the next to finally see the bridegroom, Jesus Christ, and the sacrificial love he has for us.